The year was 1876, when the Montana Territories stood as a brutal testing ground for those seeking fortune on the frontier's edge. In these windswept highlands, where blizzards could transform paradise into purgatory with terrifying swiftness, survival required more than mere strength. It demanded a spirit that refused to surrender. This is the extraordinary tale of Margaret Blackwood, a physician's widow with healing hands and a broken heart, and Swift Eagle, a Lakota hunter whose perception of the world extended far beyond what most men could see or understand. Winter had always been Margaret Blackwood's enemy. Even as a child in Connecticut, she dreaded the cold months that brought influenza to her fragile lungs. Now, at 42, she faced the Montana winter with nothing but dwindling supplies, a threadbare resolve, and memories of Edward that sometimes warmed her more than the meager fire in her hearth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She stood at the lone window of her cabin, watching. Snowflakes danced like specters in the gathering twilight. 3 months had passed since Edward's body was laid to rest behind their cabin, taken by the same fever that had claimed 4 others in Haven's Mill. Some claimed it was God's judgment on a doctor who treated natives and settlers alike. Others whispered that Margaret herself had hastened his end with her unconventional herbal remedies. The same remedies Edward had encouraged her to develop when traditional medicine failed. The accusations hurt worse than her hunger, which gnawed constantly now that supplies had dwindled to near nothing. The town's gradual rejection had evolved from subtle snubs to outright hostility after Edward's death. Margaret ran her fingers over the worn leather of her husband's medical journal, tracing the neat handwriting that documented his observations of local plants and their medicinal properties, knowledge shared freely by the Lakota whom most settlers reviled. A sharp rap at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Mrs. Blackwood, it's Sheriff Hollister." The voice carried no warmth. Margaret tightened the shawl around her shoulders and opened the door, admitting both the sheriff and a blast of bitter air that seemed determined to extinguish what little warmth remained in her home. "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a nod that was met with a grim stare. Hollister removed his hat but remained near the door. His eyes, pale as winter sky, surveyed her sparse cabin with unconcealed judgment. "Town council met yesterday evening regarding your situation," he began without preamble. "Given your husband's debts and your difficulty with neighbors, they've reached a decision." Margaret steeled herself. Each week brought new indignities as Haven's Mill sought ways to erase Edward's memory and her presence. "And what have they determined about my private affairs this time?" she asked, unable to keep bitterness from coloring her words. Hollister's expression hardened. "That tone won't serve you, Mrs. Blackwood. The council's acting out of Christian concern." He paused, examining her nearly empty shelves. "The Wilkinsons are heading to Fort Benton tomorrow. They've agreed to take you along. Reverend Clark has connections there, perhaps a position as housekeeper or laundress for a respectable family." "Laundress?" Margaret's voice rose with incredulity. "I was a physician's assistant for 15 years. I've delivered half the children in this settlement. I've stitched wounds, set bones, and treated ailments when my husband was called elsewhere. And now I'm to wash strangers' undergarments?" "The situation has changed," Hollister replied coolly, "without the doctors standing and with complaints. About your methods." He gestured vaguely at her collection of dried herbs and tinctures. "This is the Christian thing, Margaret. The Wilkinsons are good people." Margaret knew the Wilkinsons all too well. Martha Wilkinson had led the Whisper campaign, suggesting Edward's death was divine punishment for working alongside savages. Her husband Thomas had been among the first to demand payment of Edward's debts immediately after his funeral. "And if I decline this generous offer," Margaret asked. Though she already anticipated the answer, Hollister's face darkened. Then I cannot guarantee your safety or welfare. Your supplies are nearly gone. The winter's barely begun. We've all got families to protect, and some folks believe your practices attract undesirable elements to our community. There it was, the threat barely concealed beneath concern. Leave or face the consequences. I need time to consider, Margaret said, wrapping dignity around herself like armor. The Wilkinsons leave at first light, Hollister replied, already, returning his hat to his head. Pack only essentials. Their wagon has limited space, and they're doing you a considerable Christian kindness. After he departed, Margaret collapsed into Edward's chair, the wood worn smooth from his years of reading late into the night. The familiar scent of leather and pipe tobacco lingered, though fainter now, like the memory of his voice in her dreams. They had come west together 8 years before, filled with purpose and hope. Edward would heal bodies, Margaret would develop her knowledge of natural remedies, and together they would build a practice that combined the best of traditional and native approaches to medicine. Now half of their shared dream lay beneath frozen earth, and the other half was being systematically dismantled by a community that had once welcomed their skills, but now saw only Edward's debts and Margaret's peculiarities. Tucker. Night passed in restless deliberation. The practical part of her mind urged acceptance. Fort Benton was larger, with more opportunities perhaps, but her heart knew better. The Wilkinsons were traveling to join a cousin's dry goods business. Their lives revolved around appearances and convention. Under their supervision, Margaret would be little more than an indentured servant, her knowledge dismissed, her independence broken. By morning, her decision was made. She would not go. When the Wilkinsons' wagon clattered past her cabin without stopping, Margaret felt momentary panic. Had Hollister even conveyed her refusal? Had they simply assumed she would decline? She watched through frost-edged windows as the wagon disappeared into the swirling snow, feeling both relief and terror at what awaited her. 2 days later, Margaret's situation had deteriorated dramatically. The temperature plummeted further, and her woodpile dwindled to a few meager logs. She had taken to wearing every garment she owned, layered against cold that penetrated the cabin's walls, despite her efforts to seal cracks with strips of fabric. Her food stores were critically low, a handful of dried beans, half a jar of preserves, and a small sack of flour. On the third morning, she woke to find the water bucket frozen solid. The fire had died during the night, and her breath formed clouds in the frigid bedroom air. With shaking hands, she dressed and forced herself outside to collect the remaining firewood. The world beyond her door had transformed into something otherworldly and hostile. Snow had drifted against the north wall of her cabin, nearly reaching the windowsill. The path to town was completely obscured, though smoke rising from distant chimneys proved life continued there without her. As Margaret struggled to gather the last armload of wood, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached her ears. For a heartbeat, she hoped someone from town had come to check on her welfare. Then she saw them, 3 riders emerging from the tree line, moving purposefully toward her isolated cabin. As they drew closer, Margaret's hope curdled into fear. These were not townspeople. Their mismatched clothing, unkempt appearance, and the deliberate way they spread out to approach the cabin from different angles spoke of men accustomed to violence rather than neighborly concern. She dropped the wood and darted inside, throwing the bolt on her door. Edward's rifle hung above the mantel, but she'd never fired it. The ammunition was stored separately, and her trembling hands would never load it in time. The pounding at her door came seconds later. "Open up in there," a rough voice called. "Just want to talk, ma'am." Margaret backed away, searching desperately for a weapon. "Please leave," she called, trying to keep panic from her voice. "I have nothing of value." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Harsh laughter answered. Her. Hear that, boys? The doctor's widow says she's got nothing worth taking. A crash followed as something heavy struck the door. Once, twice. On the third impact, the wooden bar splintered and the door flew open. 3 men stood silhouetted against the snow, their faces partially concealed by scarves and unkempt beards. The tallest stepped forward, eyes glittering with cold amusement. Now then, ma'am, we heard tell the doctor kept a nice collection of medicine, the valuable kind that makes a man forget his troubles for a spell. Margaret's back pressed against the far wall. My husband's medicines were distributed to patients after his death. That's so? The man advanced, glancing around the cabin. Funny thing is, word says otherwise. Says his widow kept mixing up special concoctions. Says she learned all kinds of interesting tricks from the savages. The other 2 men began searching the cabin, upending her meager possessions, pulling out drawers, dumping her precious dried herbs onto the floor. There's nothing here, Margaret insisted, her voice stronger than she felt. Just medicinal herbs, nothing that would interest you. The leader moved with unexpected speed, closing the distance between them. His gloved hand gripped her throat, not quite choking, but promising worse. You misunderstand me, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm very interested in what you know, particularly about plants that bring relief from pain. His breath smelled of whiskey and tobacco. My brother took a bullet near his spine last month. Doctors can't help him, but I heard stories about the doctor's witch wife and her Injun potions. Understanding dawned with terrible clarity. These men hadn't come to rob her. They'd come to take her. I need my journals and supplies, she managed, desperate to buy time. My knowledge isn't just in my head. The man released her throat. That's more cooperative. Gather what you need, but be quick about it. Storm's getting worse, and we've got ground to cover. With shaking hands, Margaret collected Edward's journal, her own notes, and a small box containing essential herbs and tinctures. Her mind raced, searching for options that didn't exist. No one would come looking for her. Heaven's Mill had made its judgment, and these men would take her to some remote camp where she would either heal their wounded or face consequences she couldn't bear to contemplate. Time's up, the leader announced, grabbing her arm. Boys, any valuables? Nothing worth the trouble, one of his companions answered, pocketing a silver hairbrush that had been Margaret's mother's. Places poor as dirt. Outside, the snowfall had intensified, driven by winds that cut through Margaret's layers of clothing like knives of ice. They'd brought a 4th horse, a sorry-looking creature with a threadbare blanket instead of a proper. Saddle. Up you go, ma'am, the leader said, his false courtesy more frightening than outright threats. Don't get ideas about falling off or trying to turn back. Weather like this, you wouldn't last an hour on foot. As they forced her onto the horse and tied her hands to the saddle horn, Margaret looked back at her cabin, perhaps for the last time. The door hung askew from broken hinges, snow already accumulating on the threshold. Inside lay 8 years of memories. Edward's grave stood behind it, soon to be hidden completely by drifting snow, and whatever future she might have built for herself was dissolving like breath in winter air. They rode westward, away from Haven's Mill, toward the higher elevations where the storm's fury intensified with each passing mile. The bandits seemed to know their route, despite the increasingly poor visibility, following game trails that wound through stands of pine and bare-branched aspen. Margaret's thin gloves provided little protection, and numbness spread through her fingers, despite clutching the coarse mane of her mount. "How much farther?" she called to the leader who rode ahead, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Camps. Another 4 hours in good weather," he shouted back. "In this, hard to say, just pray we don't lose the trail." Prayer seemed a hollow comfort now. Margaret had stopped attending Haven's Mill's small church after Edward's death, when Reverend Clark's sermon had thinly veiled references to those who consort with spirits rather than the Holy Ghost. The Reverend had particularly objected to Edward's friendship with Swiftknife, a Lakota healer who had shared knowledge of plants that grew in the Montana highlands. Knowledge that had saved lives when conventional medicine failed. The snow thickened until the world narrowed to blinding white, punctuated by dark silhouettes of trees and the backs of the riders ahead. Time lost meaning in the monotony of cold and fear. Margaret's thoughts grew sluggish, a dangerous sign she recognized. From treating frostbite victims, hypothermia was beginning its insidious work, slowing her blood, drawing precious heat from her extremities to protect vital organs. A sharp crack shattered the muffled silence of the snow-laden forest. Ahead, the leader's horse reared suddenly, throwing him sideways. He tumbled into deep snow as his mount bolted into the trees. "Ambush!" one of the others shouted, drawing a pistol from beneath his coat. Another crack, not a gunshot, Margaret realized dimly, but the sound of ice breaking. The remaining bandit's horse had stepped onto the frozen surface of what must be a stream or small lake hidden beneath snow. The ice gave way, plunging horse and rider into frigid water. Panic erupted. The leader struggled to his feet, cursing and shouting. The second man fired blindly into the swirling snow, while the third fought to pull his mount from the breaking ice. Margaret's own horse shied violently, rearing despite its exhaustion. With her hands bound to the saddle horn, she could not control the frightened animal. It bolted, carrying her away from the chaos and deeper into the storm-ravaged forest. Branches whipped past, tearing at her clothing and face as the horse plunged through the underbrush. Each jarring stride sent pain through her cramped legs and frozen hands. She called to the animal, trying to soothe it, but terror had claimed them both. The horse from the chaos behind, Margaret from the certainty that being separated from even these brutal men meant death in the wilderness. How long the panicked flight continued, she couldn't tell. Eventually, the horse slowed, exhaustion overcoming fear. It stood trembling in a small clearing, sides heaving, steam rising from its sweat-dampened coat despite the cold. Margaret's bound hands had lost all feeling. She couldn't dismount, couldn't guide the animal, could only wait for whatever fate approached. Freezing, starvation, or perhaps the bandits would find her again. As her mount's breathing steadied, an unnatural silence settled over the forest. The wind had died temporarily, leaving only the soft whisper of falling snow. In that quiet, Margaret became aware of being watched. Primitive instinct raised the hair on her neck before conscious thought identified the sensation. She turned her head slowly, scanning the wall of white-laden pines that surrounded the clearing. There, a shadow that didn't belong, too solid, too purposeful to be mere trick of light and storm. The figure stepped forward, materializing from the curtain of snow like a spirit taking physical form. Tall and wrapped in furs, moving with deliberate grace that seemed impossible in the deep snow. As the distance closed, Margaret could make out features that marked him as native, Lakota, most likely, given their proximity to tribal lands. His face, partially covered by a fur-trimmed hood, showed strength but also caution as he assessed her predicament. Fear clawed at Margaret's throat, not because of the man's heritage, but because she presented such an obvious tableau of white distress. She had heard too many stories of settlers assuming the worst when encountering natives, responding with violence first and questions never. If this man had witnessed the chaos with the bandits, he might reasonably assume she was with them. "Please," she managed, her voice cracking from cold and disuse. "I need help, my hands—" The man approached cautiously, his movements measured to avoid startling the already nervous horse. He spoke, his words incomprehensible to Margaret, but his tone calm and even. The horse's ears flicked forward, responding to the deliberate gentleness in his voice. When he reached her side, he examined the crude bindings at her wrists without touching them. His dark eyes lifted to meet hers, questioning without words. Not by choice, Margaret explained, understanding his unspoken question. Bandits from the east. They took me from my home. The man nodded once, then reached for his belt where a knife hung in a beaded sheath. Margaret flinched instinctively, then forced herself still as he carefully cut the ropes binding her to the saddle. As circulation returned to her fingers, pain flared so intensely that tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank you," she gasped through gritted teeth. "I'm Margaret Blackwood." The man studied her for a moment before responding. "I am called Swift Eagle." His English carried an accent but was clear and deliberate. "You cannot stay here. Night comes soon. The storm grows stronger." Margaret looked around at the featureless landscape of white, suddenly aware that she had no idea which direction might lead to safety. The horse had carried her blindly into wilderness she didn't know, and the bandits, whether in pursuit or themselves lost, represented danger rather than salvation. "I don't know where to go," she admitted, the full hopelessness of her situation crashing over her like a physical wave. Swift Eagle seemed to assess both her condition and their surroundings with a single sweeping glance. "My winter camp lies to the north, not far but difficult in snow and darkness." He paused, apparently weighing options. "You will come. The alternative is death." The blunt assessment, delivered without either threat or particular compassion, carried the simple weight of truth. Margaret nodded, too exhausted and cold for pride or hesitation. This stranger represented her only chance of survival. "Can you ride still?" he asked, looking at her critically. Margaret flexed her painful fingers, willing feeling back into them. "Yes, I think so." He nodded once, then took the horse's simple bridle. "Follow close. The path is hidden, but I know it well." As they began to move, Swift Eagle leading her mount through deepening snow, Margaret found herself entrusting her life to a man from a people her own community vilified and feared. The irony wasn't lost on her, even through the haze of cold and exhaustion. Edward had often said that prejudice was a luxury of those who had never faced true desperation. In the grip of a Montana blizzard, with death pressing close from all sides, Margaret finally understood the full measure of his wisdom. Swift Eagle moved through the blinding snow with uncanny precision, following landmarks invisible to Margaret's untrained eye. The storm intensified around them, winds howling through pine branches with renewed fury as daylight faded to a murky twilight. Margaret clung to her mount, fighting waves of exhaustion that threatened to pull her from the saddle. Her fingers, painfully revived after being freed from their bindings, now ached with renewed intensity as the temperature plummeted further. "How do you find your way?" she called forward, her voice barely audible above the storm. Swift Eagle glanced back, snow collecting on the fur lining his hood. "The land speaks to those who listen," he replied simply. "This ridge has been hunting ground for my people since before your government drew lines on paper." They climbed steadily, the horse laboring through deepening snow. Margaret noticed Swift Eagle occasionally pausing to touch tree trunks, brush snow from rock formations, or study the way wind carved patterns in the drifts. His navigation was part science, part intuition, a language of survival Margaret had never learned, despite Edward's attempts to teach her wilderness skills. The cold penetrated her layers of clothing with relentless efficiency. Margaret had treated enough cases of exposure to recognize her own symptoms, the violent shivering giving way to dangerous warmth, the confusion clouding her thoughts, the leaden heaviness in her limbs. Hypothermia's deadly progression was underway. "I need to rest," she murmured, though she knew stopping meant death in these conditions. Swift Eagle turned immediately, reading her condition in a single glance. Without hesitation, he moved to her side and reached up to steady her. "The warmth you feel is false," he said firmly. "It is death approaching. We continue." He took the horse's bridle again, this time placing his other hand on Margaret's knee to stabilize her in the saddle. The simple human contact, even through layers of fabric and leather, anchored her to consciousness when darkness pressed at the edges of her vision. "Tell me of your medicine," Swift Eagle commanded, his voice cutting through her mental fog. "The White Doctor, he was your husband." The question surprised Margaret enough to focus her wandering mind. "Yes, Edward. He was," she struggled to order her thoughts, "a good physician, open-minded. He learned from your people." "The plants that heal grow for all people, not just one," Swift Eagle replied. "A wise healer knows this." Despite her dire circumstances, Margaret felt a surge of gratitude that this stranger understood what her own community had not, that knowledge transcended arbitrary boundaries of race and custom. "Edward believed that," she managed through chattering teeth. "It's why they," she swallowed hard, "why they turned against us, against me after he died." Swift Eagle nodded without turning. "Fear makes men small. Small men fear what they do not understand." They continued in silence for what seemed hours, but might have been minutes. Time had lost meaning in the white void of the storm. Margaret focused solely on remaining upright, on following the tall figure who represented her only connection to life. When her consciousness began to slip again, she forced herself to catalogue medicinal plants in her mind, reciting their properties and preparations as Edward had taught her. Red willow bark, boiled for pain and fever; echinacea root, infection and blood poisoning; wild mint, digestive distress and chest congestion. The mental exercise kept her alert, until a sudden shift in their surroundings penetrated her awareness. The howling wind had diminished, the snowfall less blinding. They had entered a natural hollow protected by towering pines and a rock formation that broke the storm's fury. "We are here," Swift Eagle announced, stopping beside what appeared at first glance to be merely another snowdrift. As Margaret's eyes adjusted, she discerned the outlines of a structure, a traditional tipi, its hide covering nearly invisible. Against the snow, except for the small smoke hole at its peak, from which a thin wisp of smoke emerged. Swift Eagle helped her dismount, catching her weight as her legs buckled. "Can you walk?" Margaret nodded, though in truth she wasn't certain. Pride drove her to take one step, then another, each movement requiring conscious effort as they approached the shelter. Swift Eagle pulled aside the entrance flap, releasing a wave of blessed warmth that made Margaret's frozen skin prickle painfully. The interior was dim but not dark, illuminated by a small central fire that cast dancing shadows on the hide walls. The space was smaller than Margaret had imagined, yet meticulously organized. Furs and blankets lined the perimeter, creating sleeping and sitting areas. Tools, weapons and containers hung from the supporting poles, or sat in precise arrangements that suggested each item had its designated place. Swift Eagle guided her to a pile of furs near the fire. "Sit. Warm slowly." Margaret sank gratefully onto the soft pelts, extending trembling hands toward the flames. The shelter's warmth enveloped her like an embrace, intensifying the pain of returning circulation to her extremities, but carrying with it the promise of survival. Swift Eagle disappeared outside briefly, returning to tend to the horse before. Securing the entrance against the storm, moving with practiced efficiency, he added wood to the fire, arranged several containers near the flames, and finally knelt across from Margaret, studying her with a healer's assessing gaze. "Your clothes are wet from snow," he observed. "This kills in winter." Margaret glanced down at her sodden skirts and jacket, suddenly aware of the dangerous moisture they trapped against her skin. In her medical practice, she had lectured countless patients about the perils of wet clothing in cold weather, yet here she sat, committing the very error she had warned against. "I have nothing else," she admitted, embarrassment coloring her cheeks despite the gravity of the situation. Swift Eagle considered this problem with the same pragmatic focus he had applied to their journey. Without comment, he moved to a parfleche container at the back of the teepee and withdrew several folded items. He placed them beside Margaret, then turned his back with deliberate courtesy. "Change," he instructed simply. "I will not look." The garments were unlike anything Margaret had worn. A dress of soft, brain-tanned deerskin decorated with subtle quillwork, leggings of the same material, and a shirt made from trade cloth. Though clearly made for a Lakota woman rather than a white settler, the clothing represented dry warmth and potential survival over modesty or cultural convention. Margaret struggled out of her frozen outer garments, fingers still clumsy with cold. The dry clothing felt foreign against her skin, but brought immediate relief as she pulled the layers on. The deerskin dress hung loosely on her frame, evidence of how much weight she had lost during the difficult months after Edward's death. "I'm decent," she said when she had finished. Swift Eagle turned, nodded once with approval at the practical solution, then busied himself preparing something in a small wooden bowl. Margaret watched as he mixed dried herbs with hot water from a container kept near the fire. "Drink," he said, offering the steaming liquid. "It will warm from within." Margaret accepted the bowl cautiously, inhaling the unfamiliar aroma, something minty blended with earthy undertones that reminded her of Edward's medicinal teas. The first sip burned her tongue, but the warmth spread through her chest, radiating outward to her limbs with surprising speed. "What is this?" she asked, taking another more careful sip. "Beaver root and wild mint," Swift Eagle replied, settling cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire. "It speeds the blood when cold has slowed it." Margaret recognized the description of improved circulation, a critical treatment for hypothermia. "My husband used willow bark and brandy for exposure cases. The white man's burning water has power," Swift Eagle acknowledged, "but the plants alone are enough if gathered at the proper time with respect." He fed the fire methodically, positioning each piece of wood to maximize heat while conserving fuel. Margaret noticed his movements were deliberate but graceful, nothing wasted, nothing excessive. A man who had learned to survive through careful stewardship of resources. As warmth gradually returned to her body, Margaret's mind cleared enough to fully comprehend her situation. She sat in a traditional Lakota dwelling, wearing native women's clothing, sharing fire with a man whose people were reviled and feared by her own community. Had Edward lived to see this moment, he would have appreciated the irony. His wife finding safety among those the townspeople considered savages, while civilized men had abducted and abandoned her to die. "Your camp," Margaret began, looking around with new clarity. "You live here alone." Swift Eagle nodded. "During winter moons, my band travels south when snow comes, following buffalo to sheltered valleys. I remain to watch ancestral hunting grounds to ensure treaty boundaries are respected." His tone carried no resentment, merely stating facts. "Isn't that dangerous?" Margaret asked, "being isolated from your people?" "Less dangerous than what awaits if white settlers claim these lands unchallenged," he replied evenly. "My father was war chief. He fought and died at Greasy Grass when I was young. I choose different path. To watch, to learn white ways, to speak for my people when treaties are discussed." "You were at Little Bighorn." Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. "Your people call it this. We name it Victory at Greasy Grass." Swift Eagle's expression remained neutral, neither boasting nor apologizing. "I was there but did not fight. My father believed some must live to remember, to tell truth when others write false stories." The implications of his statement hung between them. This man had witnessed one of the most controversial battles in recent history, a devastating defeat for the U.S. Army that had fueled anti-native sentiment throughout the territories. Yet here he sat, sharing his fire and medicine with a white woman who by all rights should represent the enemy. "The men who took you," Swift Eagle changed the subject abruptly. "They sought medicines." Margaret nodded, relieved to address more immediate concerns. "Their leader mentioned a brother with a spine injury. They believed I possessed Indian remedies that might help where doctors had failed." She gestured to the small bag of medical supplies she'd been allowed to bring. "I doubt anything I have would significantly help such a serious condition." Swift Eagle's gaze sharpened. "These men, did they speak of their camp? How many travel together?" "They mentioned being 4 hours away in good weather," Margaret recalled. "The leader called himself Jenkins. From what I gathered, there are at least 5 or 6 of them, perhaps more. Jenkins." Swift Eagle spoke the name with recognition. "Horse thieves, whiskey traders. They camp near Broken Ridge during winter, raid settlements when snow melts." He added another stick to the fire, considering. "They will search when storm passes. Such men do not surrender what they believe is theirs." The warning sent a chill through Margaret despite the shelter's warmth. Her situation had improved from imminent death to temporary safety, but the fundamental reality remained unchanged. She existed in a liminal space between worlds, belonging nowhere, wanted only for what knowledge she might provide. "Will they be able to find this place?" she asked, anxiety tightening her chest. Swift Eagle shook his head. "Not if snow continues. Tracks vanish. There are many hidden valleys in these mountains." He studied her with penetrating intensity. "But when weather clears, you must decide your path. Haven's Mill has rejected you. The bandits would use you, then discard you. My people's winter camp lies 5 days' journey south, but they would question a white woman's presence." The stark assessment of her limited options struck Margaret with the force of physical pain. Edward's death had begun her untethering from society, but this moment crystallized her true position. Adrift between cultures, without community or protection, beyond what this stranger might choose to provide. "For tonight, rest," Swift Eagle said, apparently reading the distress in her expression. "Storm speaks of continuing until morning. No decisions need be made when body and spirit require healing." He rose and moved to prepare simple food. Dried meat reconstituted in hot water, with what appeared to be wild onions and dried berries added for sustenance. The savory aroma reminded Margaret how long it had been since she'd eaten properly, hunger suddenly overshadowing her anxiety. They shared the meal in companionable silence, the howling storm outside making their small circle of warmth feel like the only reality in a world gone white and wild. Margaret studied her unlikely rescuer surreptitiously, noting details her earlier distress had obscured. Swift Eagle appeared to be in his early 40s, though it was difficult to judge precisely. His face bore the weathering of a life lived primarily outdoors, yet lacked the deep creases of advanced age. A single streak of grey ran through his black hair, which he wore longer than white men, but tied back practically. Most striking were his eyes, dark, intelligent and evaluating, missing nothing yet revealing little of his inner thoughts. "You stare with questions," he observed without looking up from his meal. Margaret flushed, embarrassed at being caught in her scrutiny. "I apologize, it's just, you're not what I expected. And what did you expect from a Lakota hunter?" The question carried no offense, merely curiosity. Yet Margaret struggled to answer honestly without revealing the prejudices she had unconsciously absorbed, despite Edward's more enlightened views. "Someone more—" She hesitated, searching for words, traditional perhaps, less familiar with English and white ways. Swift Eagle's expression remained neutral. "The deer hunter must understand deer to find them. The man who hunts buffalo must know their habits. So too must my people understand those who now surround our lands." He set aside his empty bowl. "I learned your language at mission school. Served as translator when army officers came to speak with elders." Knowledge is weapon sharper than any knife. My husband said something similar, Margaret replied softly. That understanding builds bridges where fear builds walls. For the first time, Swift Eagle's expression softened slightly. Your husband showed wisdom unusual among settlers. This explains why Haven's Mill rejected his widow. The simple validation of Edward's principles, and by extension her own, from this unexpected source brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to indulge in self-pity when mere hours ago she had faced certain death. Rest now, Swift Eagle advised, noting her exhaustion. The body heals in sleep what medicine cannot reach. He arranged sleeping furs for her near the fire, then moved to his own sleeping place on the opposite side of the teepee, close enough to share the fire's warmth, distant enough to maintain propriety. As Margaret settled into the soft pelts, their musky scent unfamiliar yet comforting, she realized this was the first time since Edward's death that she had felt truly safe. Outside, the Montana winter unleashed its full fury, wind screaming through, pine boughs and snow accumulating in drifts that would reshape the landscape by morning. But within the shelter of Swift Eagle's teepee, Margaret Blackwood drifted towards sleep with the strange certainty that she had found temporary harbor in the most unlikely of places, with a man whose people she had been taught to fear, but whose actions embodied the compassion her own community had abandoned. Margaret awakened to unfamiliar silence. The storm's relentless voice had diminished to occasional sighs as wind swept across the snow-laden landscape. Light filtered through the smoke hole above, casting a pale circle on the packed earth floor. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place herself, the deerskin garments against her skin, the unfamiliar sense of pine smoke and cured hides, the rounded space unlike any settler's cabin. Then memory returned in a rush. Haven's Mill's rejection, the bandits' abduction, her desperate flight through the blizzard, and finally Swift Eagle's unexpected rescue. She sat up slowly, muscles protesting after yesterday's ordeal. The teepee was empty, though the fire still burned steadily, evidence of recent tending. Margaret pushed aside the sleeping furs and stood cautiously, testing her strength. Her body ached, but the bone-deep cold had retreated. The herbal tea Swift Eagle had prepared had done its work, restoring circulation and preventing the worst effects of her exposure. She crossed to the entrance flap and pushed it aside, just enough to peer outside. The world beyond had transformed overnight. What had been a chaotic maelstrom of wind-driven snow now stood pristine and still under crystalline morning light. Drifts had sculpted the landscape into flowing forms that reminded Margaret of ocean waves frozen in mid-motion. The teepee stood in a natural hollow, partially sheltered by towering pines whose branches sagged under their white burden. Swift Eagle was tending to the horse some distance away, clearing a small area of snow and spreading dried grasses he must have stored for winter feeding. The animal looked remarkably recovered after yesterday's ordeal, steam rising from its back in the cold air as it pulled at the offered fodder. Margaret let the flap fall closed, conscious of her strange appearance in Lakota women's clothing. Despite the circumstances that had made the change necessary, she felt a curious sense of impropriety, as if she were playing at being someone she wasn't. Edward would have found her discomfort amusing, he who had adopted elements of native dress himself when their practicality outweighed convention. She used the momentary solitude to take better stock of her surroundings. Swift Eagle's winter dwelling bore little resemblance to the chaotic teepees depicted in dime novels that occasionally reached Haven's Mill. Instead, the space reflected careful organization and surprising sophistication. Tools hung from rawhide, loops attached to the support poles arranged by function. Storage containers, some traditional parfleche, others clearly of white manufacture, were stacked according to some system she didn't yet understand. Most intriguing was a small area that appeared dedicated to medicine. Margaret recognized many of the dried plants bundled and hanging from one section of the framework: echinacea, yarrow, wild ginger root. Others were unfamiliar, their properties unknown to her despite Edward's teachings. A flat stone served as mixing surface with smaller stones of various sizes arranged nearby for grinding and preparing remedies. "You recognize the plants that heal?" Margaret startled at Swift Eagle's voice. He had returned so silently she hadn't heard the entrance. "Flap move." "Some of them," she acknowledged. "My husband learned from a Lakota healer near Fort Keogh. He called himself Swift Knife." A flicker of recognition crossed Swift Eagle's normally impassive features. "My mother's cousin, a wise man who believed knowledge should flow between peoples, not stop at boundaries drawn on paper." The connection surprised Margaret. "You're related to him." Edward considered him a friend as well as teacher. Swift Eagle nodded, moving to add wood to the central fire. "Our bands separated after Greasy Grass. Some sought peace near army forts when hunting became difficult. Others, like my father's people, refused surrender." He glanced at her. "Swift Knife chose the middle path, to live near whites, but keep our ways alive through sharing knowledge." "That's what Edward admired most," Margaret said softly. "His willingness to teach rather than withhold wisdom. And this is why your town rejected you?" Swift Eagle asked. Though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, Margaret settled back onto her sleeping furs as Swift Eagle prepared a simple morning meal. Partly, while Edward lived, his position as doctor provided some protection from criticism. After his death, she trailed off, the memory still raw. They tolerated his peculiarities because he saved their children from fever and set their broken bones. A widow practicing herbal medicine learned from natives was simply a threat. "Fear makes men cruel," Swift Eagle observed, handing her a wooden bowl containing what appeared to be a porridge made from ground roots and dried berries. "Even toward those they once called neighbor." They ate in companionable silence. The only sounds the occasional pop from the fire and the distant call of a raven outside. Margaret found herself studying Swift Eagle with daylight's clarity, noticing details obscured by last night's exhaustion. A scar ran along his left jawline, old and well-healed but clearly from a serious wound. His hands, though strong and capable, showed evidence of past breaks that had mended without proper setting. Most telling was a burn scar visible at his wrist when his sleeve pulled back, the distinctive pattern of army branding irons used on captured hostiles during the early campaigns. He had been marked as an enemy, yet had chosen to remain in contested territory, maintaining watch over ancestral lands rather than retreating with his band. The courage such a decision required impressed Margaret deeply. "The storm has passed," Swift Eagle said, interrupting her thoughts. "But the snow is deep. Travel would be difficult for several days." The statement carried an implicit question about her intentions, reminding Margaret of their conversation the previous night. Her options remained unchanged. Attempt to return to a community that had rejected her, seek her meager chances elsewhere, or consider alternatives that crossed boundaries few white women ever traversed. "The men who took me," she began hesitantly. "You said they would search once weather cleared?" Swift Eagle nodded. "Men like Jenkins do not surrender prizes easily. They will backtrack, search for Horse's Trail when snow hardens enough for travel. Would they find this place?" He considered the question seriously. "Not easily. I choose winter camp locations carefully, away from common paths, but determined men with skilled trackers might eventually discover it." The acknowledgement sent a chill through Margaret despite the tippy's warmth. Her presence endangered not only herself, but also the man who had saved her life. I should leave when possible, she concluded reluctantly. My presence brings risk you didn't choose. Where would? You go? Swift Eagle's question carried no judgment, merely practical assessment. Haven's Mill has closed its doors. Fort Benton lies many days' journey through deep snow. The bandits control the western approach. Put so bluntly, Margaret's lack of viable options stood exposed. Sensing her distress, Swift Eagle continued more gently. No decision must be made today. Snow will prevent any movement for at least 3 days. Use this time to regain strength, to consider paths forward with clear mind. The practical wisdom in his approach calmed Margaret's rising anxiety. Edward had often counseled patients against making life-altering decisions while in the grip of illness or trauma. Wait until the fever breaks before selling the farm. He would advise families gathered anxiously around sickbeds. You're right, she acknowledged, and I'm grateful for the shelter, however temporary. Swift Eagle nodded once, accepting her thanks without elaboration. He rose and began gathering items into a small pack. I must check snare lines, ensure no game has suffered needlessly in traps during the storm. Will you be comfortable alone? For some hours? The question surprised Margaret, not its content, but the courtesy it represented. Few white men would have considered a woman's comfort in similar circumstances. Of course, she assured him. Is there something I might do in your absence? I dislike being idle when there's work to be done. Swift Eagle considered her offer. The medicine bundles require sorting. Some herbs lose potency if kept too long. He gestured toward the collection hanging from the support poles. If you know plants well enough to separate those still strong from those that should return to earth. Margaret welcomed the opportunity to contribute. I can manage that. Edward was insistent about proper storage and disposal of medicinals. After Swift Eagle's departure, Margaret approached the medicine area with respectful caution. Among Edward's Lakota patients, handling another's healing supplies without permission would have been considered deeply presumptuous. Though Swift Eagle had explicitly invited her assistance, she still felt like an intruder in this most personal aspect of his dwelling. She began carefully, examining each bundle before determining its condition. Many were familiar. Echinacea, root, willow bark, wild ginger. Others she recognized by sight but not by Lakota name, their properties something Edward had discussed during their years together. A few were completely unknown, and these she set aside, unwilling to risk discarding. Something valuable through ignorance. The work absorbed her completely, returning a sense of purpose she had lost after Edward's death. This was familiar territory, assessing medicinal quality, organizing supplies, preparing for future need. The systematic approach to healing that had drawn her to assist Edward's practice provided comfort now, a reminder that her knowledge retained value even when her community rejected it. As midday approached, Margaret had created neat piles, herbs to keep, those to discard with proper ceremony, as Swift Eagle would no doubt prefer, and those she couldn't identify with certainty. The organization brought order to her thoughts as well, helping her consider her situation with greater clarity than panic had previously allowed. Swift Eagle returned as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, bringing several snowshoe hares from his trap lines. He paused in the entrance, taking in Margaret's careful organization of his medicinal supplies with an expression that might have been approval. You have healer's hands, he observed, moving to prepare the rabbits for cooking. Careful but confident. Margaret accepted the compliment with quiet dignity. My father was an apothecary in Boston before consumption took him. I learned basic principles from childhood, then expanded my knowledge working alongside Edward. Swift Eagle nodded as he worked, skinning the hares with practiced efficiency. Women among my people are often strongest healers. They understand how life flows, how balance must be maintained between body and spirit. Haven's Mill preferred. The doctor's wife assists with birthing and women's complaints, Margaret said wryly. Male ailments were considered improper for my attention, regardless of my knowledge. White ways separate what belongs together, Swift Eagle replied. Body from spirit, man's knowledge from woman's wisdom, people from the land that sustains them. He glanced up from his work. This creates sickness deeper than any plant can heal. The philosophical observation surprised Margaret, revealing depth of thought beyond the stoic pragmatism Swift Eagle usually displayed. It echoed conversations she'd had with Edward during their years together, discussions about holistic approaches to medicine that incorporated emotional and spiritual well-being alongside physical treatment. My husband believed similarly, she said. It made him unusual among physicians, especially here in the territories. And this brought trouble to your door, Swift Eagle concluded. It wasn't a question. Margaret sighed. People fear what challenges their understanding of the world. Edward's willingness to learn from Lakota healers threatened those who believe progress only moves in one direction, from east to west, from white to native, never the reverse. Swift Eagle finished preparing the rabbits and arranged them for cooking. As he worked, Margaret noticed how his movements reflected the same economy she'd observed in other aspects of his life. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive, each action purposeful. It stood in stark contrast to the casual wastefulness she'd witnessed among even the poorest settlers. Tell me of the men who took you, he said abruptly, changing the subject. Did they speak of specific medicine they sought? Margaret considered the question. Their leader, Jenkins, mentioned his brother had taken a bullet near the spine. He believes I possess remedies for pain that conventional doctors cannot provide. And do you? Perhaps, she admitted. Edward developed a tincture, combining willow bark with other elements that proved effective for deep-seated pain, but no medicine can repair a shattered spine. At best, we might offer comfort, not cure. Swift Eagle nodded thoughtfully. Such men do not distinguish between comfort and cure. They demand magic, not medicine. The assessment rang true. Jenkins had spoken of Indian potions with a mixture of disdain and desperate hope that suggested he expected miraculous results rather than realistic treatment. I've encountered that expectation before, Margaret acknowledged. When conventional medicine fails, patients often seek alternatives with impossible expectations. Hope becomes hunger, Swift Eagle observed. Hunger becomes demand. Demand becomes violence when unfulfilled. The progression he outlined painted a disturbing picture of what awaited if Jenkins tracked her to this shelter. His band would not accept limitations or failure, especially after risking the journey to abduct her. They settled into preparing and sharing the evening meal, conversation shifting to more immediate concerns of winter survival. Swift Eagle explained his methodical approach to managing resources through Montana's harsh season. Trap lines rotated to prevent depletion, food stores calculated precisely, firewood harvested and dried months in advance. Your planning is impressive, Margaret remarked as they finished eating. Most settlers I've known approach winter with far less foresight. White men believe nature exists to serve them, Swift Eagle replied without rancor, simply stating his observation. My people understand we exist within nature's balance. Disturb this balance through greed or carelessness, all suffer. The winter teaches this lesson most clearly. As darkness gathered outside, Swift Eagle busied himself with mending snowshoes. By firelight, Margaret watched his skilled hands weaving replacement lacings through the wooden frames, fascinated by the precision of his movements. Tomorrow, if weather holds, we should determine your path forward, he said without looking up from his work. 3 directions lie before you. East toward Haven's Mill, though they have shown their hearts toward you already. North toward Fort Benton, though the journey would be difficult alone, or south, where my people's winter camp might offer temporary refuge. The third option startled Margaret. Your people would accept a white woman in their midst? Swift Eagle's hands paused, momentarily, not without question, not without caution. But Swift Knife's influence remains strong. If you come under his protection as student of healing ways, some doors might open. And would you... Margaret hesitated, uncertain how to phrase her question without presumption. Would I speak for you? Swift Eagle finished for her. I would tell truth of how our paths crossed, how you respect our medicine knowledge. Beyond this, your words and actions must earn their own regard. The honest assessment carried neither promise nor discouragement, merely reality. If she chose that path, Margaret would face skepticism and likely hostility, with no guarantee of acceptance. Yet something in the possibility called to her, a continuation of the journey Edward had begun, rather than retreat to a world that had already rejected her contributions. I need time to consider, she said finally. Swift Eagle nodded, returning to his repair work. The sun rises regardless of our decisions. Tomorrow brings its own wisdom. They lapsed into companionable silence as the fire burned low. Margaret found herself studying her unlikely host with growing curiosity. Despite hours in his company, Swift Eagle remained largely a mystery, his thoughts private, his history shared only in fragments, his motivations unclear beyond immediate pragmatism. "May I ask you something?" she ventured finally. He looked up, dark eyes reflecting firelight. "You may ask, I may choose not to answer. Why do you remain here alone? You spoke of your band traveling south for winter, yet you stay in these mountains, isolated from your people." Swift Eagle was silent so long that Margaret feared she had overstepped some boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a depth of emotion she hadn't heard before. "After Greasy Grass, what you call Little Bighorn, many paths opened before our people. Some chose surrender at agencies, others fled north to grandmother's land, beyond your country's reach. My father's band refused both paths. They believed our ways could continue in these mountains, away from soldiers' eyes." He set aside the snowshoe, his focus turning inward. 3 winters passed. Army patrols discovered their hunting camp. Women, children, old ones, all were there when blue coats arrived. The commander demanded surrender, promised food and blankets at the reservation. Margaret felt a growing sense of dread at where this story led. My father refused. He had seen reservation promises turn to dust before. That night, soldiers surrounded the camp. When dawn came, Swift Eagle's voice remained level, but something in his eyes reflected ancient pain. 38 of our band died. 18 women and children survived to be marched to Fort Keogh. In winter snow, and you weren't there, Margaret whispered, understanding dawning. I was meeting with Swift Knife, discussing how to approach army commanders with new peace proposals. His hands tightened momentarily. When I returned, I found only bodies frozen beneath snow and tracks leading eastward. The stark tragedy left Margaret speechless. No newspapers had reported such an incident, or if they had, Haven's Mill had. Received only sanitized accounts of hostiles pacified rather than the massacre Swift Eagle described. I failed my responsibility as my father's son, he continued after a moment. Now I keep watch over ancestral lands, ensure those who died are remembered, maintain our claim to these mountains through my presence. It is small honor compared to their sacrifice, but it is what remains possible. The personal revelation transformed Margaret's understanding of the man who had saved her life. What she had interpreted as mere preference for solitude was in fact a profound act of witness and remembrance, a living testimony to a tragedy history would likely erase. "I'm deeply sorry," she said simply, knowing no words could adequately address such loss, Swift Eagle acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. Your husband sought to build understanding between our peoples. This honors the dead more than revenge or hatred. Perhaps this is why I found you when the storm spoke loudest. He rose, clearly indicating the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Rest now. Tomorrow brings decisions that require clear mind and strong heart. As Margaret settled onto her sleeping furs, she found herself looking at her situation through a lens transformed by Swift Eagle's revelation. Her own troubles, significant though they were, seemed somehow smaller measured against the weight of history and survival he carried. Yet rather than diminishing her circumstances, the comparison strengthened her resolve. If this man could maintain dignity and purpose despite such devastating loss, surely she could find her own path forward without surrendering to despair or compromising the principles she shared with Edward. Whatever direction she chose when morning came, it would be with clearer understanding of both her limitations and her capacity for resilience. Outside, the temperature dropped as night deepened, stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the snow-covered landscape. Within the teepee's sheltering circle, Margaret drifted toward sleep, watching firelight paint shadow patterns across the curve of hide walls, conscious that safety was temporary, but grateful for its unexpected provision. Tomorrow would indeed bring decisions, but tonight offered healing rest and the quiet companionship of a fellow traveler on life's difficult journey. Dawn broke with crystalline clarity over the snow-covered mountains. Margaret awoke to the scent of pine smoke and something unfamiliar yet appetizing cooking over the central fire. Swift Eagle knelt beside the flames, tending a mixture in a small iron pot, one of the few clearly non-native implements in his possession. "Good morning," Margaret said, sitting up and arranging her borrowed deerskin garments. Swift Eagle acknowledged her with a nod. "The day brings good traveling weather for those prepared. Sun strong, wind calm, snow forming crust that will support snowshoes." He gestured toward the pot. "Eat, strength needed regardless of path chosen." The meal proved to be a rich porridge of groundnuts, dried berries, and what tasted like wild honey, far more substantial than anything Margaret had eaten in the lean months following Edward's death. She ate gratefully, aware that Swift Eagle watched her with the assessing gaze she'd come to recognize as his healer's perspective, evaluating her recovery. "Your color improves," he observed. "The cold's shadow recedes, thanks to your care," Margaret acknowledged. "I would have died in that storm without your intervention." Swift Eagle dismissed her gratitude with a slight gesture. "Life gives opportunities to balance scales. Perhaps your husband's respect for my people returns now as protection for his widow." The sentiment surprised Margaret, not its generosity, but the spiritual worldview it represented. Swift Eagle perceived connections and reciprocity, where most whites saw only random chance or, at best, divine providence detached from human actions. "Have you decided your path?" he asked directly, setting aside his own empty bowl. Margaret had, indeed, spent much of the night weighing her limited options. Returning to Haven's Mill meant facing a community that had already demonstrated its unwillingness to support her. Attempting to reach Fort Benton alone was tantamount to suicide, given the season and her limited wilderness skills. The third option, traveling to the Lakota winter camp under Swift Knife's potential protection, carried its own significant risks, but at least offered possibility rather than certain failure. "I believe my best chance lies with reaching your people's winter camp," she said finally. "If Swift Knife would consider extending protection based on Edward's past friendship." Swift Eagle studied her, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts regarding her decision. "The journey requires 5 days if weather holds. Difficult travel through deep snow. Are you strong enough?" The question contained no judgment, merely practical assessment. Margaret appreciated his directness, so different from the false assurances and hidden agendas she'd encountered in Haven's Mill. "I believe so," she replied with equal honesty. "I'm stronger than I appear, and motivation lends its own strength. Will you guide me there?" "Yes." Swift Eagle began gathering items as he spoke. "We leave tomorrow at dawn. Today we prepare. You need proper clothing for journey, knowledge of using snowshoes, understanding of survival if we become separated." The intensive preparation began immediately. Swift Eagle brought forth winter garments clearly fashioned for serious travel, rather than merely staying near the shelter. Fur-lined moccasins designed to be worn over multiple layers of wrappings, leggings reinforced at the knee and ankle, a capote-style coat made from traded wool blankets but cut in native fashion for maximum protection against wind. Most impressively, he produced mittens lined with rabbit fur, with separate inner linings that could be removed and dried at night. "These belonged to my sister," he explained, as Margaret examined the beautifully beaded mittens. "She journeys, now in spirit world, but would approve their use to protect healing hands." The personal nature of the gift moved Margaret deeply. "I will use them with respect," she promised. Swift Eagle nodded, satisfied, then turned to practical instruction. "First, snowshoes. Without them, we cannot travel." The subsequent lesson proved more physically demanding than Margaret had anticipated. Swift Eagle led her outside into the brilliant winter sunlight, where the snow had indeed formed a light crust that shattered like glass beneath their weight. He demonstrated the proper technique for walking in the traditional wooden-framed snowshoes, a slightly rolling gait that kept the frames mostly atop the snow rather than punching through. Margaret's first attempts were ungainly, resulting in tangled frames and several falls into powdery drifts. Swift Eagle watched without comment, allowing her to find her balance through trial and error. By midday, she had progressed from awkward stumbling to moderately effective forward movement, though still lacking the fluid grace with which he navigated the snowy landscape. "Enough," he announced as the sun reached its zenith. "Skills improve with practice, but too much strain first day brings pain that slows journey." They returned to the tepee for a brief meal, after which Swift Eagle turned to what Margaret recognized as equally critical preparation: knowledge transfer. "Maps exist in mind before paper," he began, using a stick to draw in the packed earth floor near the fire. "Our path follows Rattlesnake Creek Valley southward for 2 days, then crosses Bear Tooth Pass if weather permits. Beyond lies Medicine Lake, where winter camp circles stand." He illustrated each landmark with simple but precise drawings, creating a mental map Margaret committed to memory. "If we become separated," he continued, "follow creek downstream. Never cross open ridges where wind creates deadly cold. Seek sheltered valleys, southern slopes where snow melts first." The survival instruction continued throughout the afternoon. How to recognize weather signs that preceded storms, which trees offered the driest bark for emergency fires, how to create expedient shelter if caught away from proper protection. Margaret absorbed everything with the same focused attention she had once given to Edward's medical teachings, recognizing that this knowledge might mean the difference between life and death. As evening approached, Swift Eagle turned from wilderness skills to cultural preparation. "My people's winter camp holds many bands together. Some welcome outsiders, others remember only broken treaties and white deception. You must understand basic customs to avoid giving unintended offense." He explained fundamental protocols, how to approach a tipi properly, waiting for invitation, rather than entering directly. The importance of accepting food when offered regardless of appetite, how to address elders and tribal leaders with appropriate respect. Margaret listened intently, recognizing that her reception would depend as much on cultural sensitivity as on Swift Knife's potential advocacy. "Women's status differs from white settlements," Swift Eagle added. "Lakota women own tipis, control, household, have voice in council through family representatives, not silent shadows as in your churches and meetings. That sounds rather refreshing, Margaret remarked with unexpected candor. Haven's Mill restricted women's voices to sewing, circles and children's matters. Swift Eagle's expression suggested he found such limitations incomprehensible. How can half the people remain silent and community remain strong, like bird with one wing, much flapping, no flight? The metaphor surprised a laugh from Margaret, the first genuine amusement she'd felt since Edward's death. Swift Eagle's features softened briefly in response, though he didn't quite smile. Their preparations continued into evening, checking supplies, repairing travel gear, calculating provisions needed for a 5-day journey. As they worked, Margaret found herself studying Swift Eagle with growing curiosity about his personal history beyond the tragedy he had shared. "May I ask about your life before?" She hesitated, unsure how to reference the massacre he had described. "Before soldiers came," he completed her question matter-of-factly. "What do you wish to know?" "You speak English exceptionally well, understand white customs, yet choose to live traditionally. I'm curious how your path led to such knowledge." Swift Eagle considered her question while repairing a small tear in one of the parfleche bags they would carry. "My father was war chief, but also wise leader who saw changing times. He sent me to mission school for 3 winters when I was young, believing knowledge of enemy strengthens defense." "You considered all whites the enemy?" Margaret asked carefully. "Those who wanted our land, broke treaties, brought soldiers?" "Yes." He met her gaze directly. "Others who came with respect, who traded fairly, who learned our ways. These were not enemies, but simply other people walking different path." He returned to his repair work, fingers deftly threading sinew through the tough hide. After school. Years. I worked as translator when government men came to speak with chiefs. Later, guided army patrols through mountains, learning their methods while showing only what my father approved. "A dangerous position," Margaret observed. "Trusted, completely by neither side. Walking between worlds requires balance," Swift Eagle agreed. "Step too far one direction, fall into suspicion. Too far opposite way, lose connection to your people, always watching foot placement, like crossing stream on slippery stones." The metaphor captured perfectly the precarious navigation required of cultural intermediaries, a position Margaret herself might soon experience if they successfully reached the winter camp. She would be neither fully accepted nor entirely rejected, existing in the uncomfortable space between established boundaries. As the fire burned low and preparation activities concluded, Swift Eagle turned to more immediate concerns. "We should sleep soon. Dawn comes quickly, and first day's travel tests endurance most severely." Margaret nodded, arranging her sleeping furs near the fire as she had the previous nights. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a journey with no certain outcome. A leap of faith into an existence even Edward might have found challenging despite his open-minded nature. "I want to thank you," she said suddenly, needing to express her gratitude before their departure. "Not just for saving my life in the storm, but for offering a path forward when all others closed." Swift Eagle regarded her thoughtfully. "Thanks. Better expressed through living well than words. Honor knowledge shared by using it wisely. This repays any debt." His pragmatic response embodied the practical philosophy that had impressed Margaret throughout their brief acquaintance. Swift Eagle measured value through actions and outcomes rather than sentiment or social niceties, a refreshing directness after Haven's Mill's hypocrisy. Morning arrived with the soft blue light of winter dawn filtering through the smoke hole. Margaret awakened to find Swift Eagle already busy with final preparations, packing provisions into parfleche containers and checking the snowshoes one. Last time for any weaknesses that might fail during travel. They broke fast with journey food, pemmican made from dried meat pounded with berries and tallow, sustaining and portable. Margaret had tasted similar provisions when accompanying Edward on longer house calls to outlying homesteads, though Swift Eagle's version contained unfamiliar herbs that added both flavor and, she suspected, medicinal properties. "The horse cannot accompany us," Swift Eagle explained as they prepared to depart. "Snow too deep for safe travel. I have created cache of feed that will sustain him until spring brings new growth." Margaret nodded understanding. The animal had been left to roam within the sheltered valley, apparently content with the arrangement. She had grown fond of the sturdy creature that had carried her through the blizzard, but recognized the practical necessity of continuing on foot. The tipi required careful closing, not dismantled as she had expected, but secured against weather and possible animal intrusion. Swift Eagle explained that they would return after reaching the winter camp, bringing others to help transport his belongings for the remaining winter months. "The journey requires focus," he cautioned as they prepared to depart. "Follow my tracks." "Precisely. Conserve strength. Speak if weakness comes. Pride before safety brings death in winter mountains." Margaret appreciated his direct instructions. Edward had similarly valued honesty about limitations when treating patients with critical conditions. False confidence helped no one when lives hung in balance. They set out as the sun crested the eastern ridges, casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. Swift Eagle led, breaking trail with practiced efficiency, his movements displaying the fluid grace Margaret had attempted to emulate during yesterday's lessons. She followed several paces behind, concentrating on maintaining the rolling snowshoe gait he had demonstrated. The initial hours passed in focused silence, both conserving energy for the physical demands of travel. Swift Eagle occasionally pointed out landmarks or signs of wildlife, tracks crossing their path, ravens circling overhead, a distant movement that might have been elk navigating the winter landscape. Margaret absorbed these observations gratefully, beginning to read the natural world through his experienced perspective. By midday, her muscles protested the unaccustomed movement. The snowshoe gait worked unfamiliar combinations of tendons and ligaments, creating deep aches in calves and thighs. Swift Eagle appeared to sense her fatigue before she voiced it, calling a halt in a sheltered grove of pines where fallen logs provided natural seating cleared of snow by overhanging branches. "First day always hardest," he observed, offering her pemmican and a small water skin. "Body remembers by tomorrow." "I hope you're right," Margaret replied with rueful honesty. "I fear I'm slowing our progress considerably." "Pace matches need," Swift Eagle answered practically. "Too fast brings exhaustion, risk of injury. Too slow means insufficient distance before nightfall. Finding balance matters more than speed." The wisdom applied beyond their immediate journey, Margaret reflected. Her entire life had become an exercise in finding balance between respecting Edward's memory and creating her own path forward, between honoring her medical knowledge and adapting to new circumstances, between maintaining her cultural identity and opening herself to different ways of understanding the world. They resumed travel after a brief rest, continuing southward along the valley Swift Eagle had identified as their route. The afternoon brought changing terrain as they descended slightly, following the course of a stream now buried beneath snow but marked by the depression of its channel and the willows that lined its banks. As the short winter day began to wane, Swift Eagle led them toward a rock outcropping that provided natural windbreak. "We camp here," he announced. "Good protection, dry wood available, water nearby beneath ice." Margaret watched with admiration as he efficiently established their night camp. Unlike the elaborate preparations required by white hunting expeditions, Swift Eagle carried minimal equipment but utilized it with maximum effectiveness. A small fire pit dug through snow to mineral soil, sheltered by strategic placement of gathered branches. Sleeping areas created from boughs laid atop snow, then covered with hides from his pack. a cooking area arranged to capture both heat and light while minimizing smoke. As darkness settled over the landscape, they shared another meal of travel provisions, supplemented by tea made from pine needles, rich in properties that Edward had identified as preventing the bleeding gums and weakness of scurvy that plagued many settlers during winter months. "You've traveled this route often?" Margaret asked as they sat beside the small fire, its flames reflecting off surrounding snow to create a cocoon of golden light amid the vast darkness. "Many times," Swift Eagle confirmed. "First with my father, when old enough for winter hunts. Later alone, carrying messages between bands when separation became necessary for survival. And always in winter?" The concept seemed unnecessarily challenging to Margaret's perspective. "Winter trails tell truth," he replied enigmatically. "When?" Margaret's expression showed confusion, he elaborated. "Summer travel leaves many options. Easy paths, abundant food, little danger except from two-legged enemies. Winter journey reveals character, tests preparation, exposes weakness that easier seasons conceal." The philosophy captured something fundamental about his approach to life. A willingness to face hardship directly, finding clarity through challenge rather than seeking comfort at any cost. It contrasted sharply with Haven's Mill's rejection of Margaret when her presence required accommodation following Edward's death. As they prepared for sleep beneath brilliant stars, Margaret found herself contemplating the journey ahead with renewed perspective. The physical discomfort of snowshoe travel, the cold that penetrated even her layered clothing, the uncertainty awaiting at journey's end, all were simply realities to be faced rather than hardships to be avoided. Swift Eagle arranged their sleeping, places closely enough to share warmth without impropriety, explaining matter-of-factly that survival trumped social conventions in winter mountains. Too exhausted to feel awkward, Margaret settled into the nest of furs and branches, muscles aching but mind strangely at peace despite their precarious circumstances. The second day of travel brought the physical improvement Swift Eagle had predicted. Margaret's body, having adapted somewhat to the demands of snowshoe travel, moved with greater efficiency, if not yet grace. They made better progress, following the gradually descending valley as it widened toward broader plains visible in the distance. Near midday, Swift Eagle suddenly raised his hand in a silent signal to stop. Margaret froze in place, sensing his focused alertness. He studied the landscape ahead intently, then motioned her to join him where he stood. "Look there," he directed quietly, pointing toward a distant ridgeline. "Smoke rises against wind direction." Margaret strained to see what had caught his attention. At first, she perceived nothing unusual in the winter landscape, then noticed a faint smudge against the blue sky, unnatural in its vertical rise when the light breeze blew from the opposite direction. "A campfire?" she asked, keeping her voice low, though the distance made it unlikely anyone could hear them. "Signal fire," Swift Eagle corrected grimly, "placed to be seen from multiple directions." "The bandits searching for me?" Fear tightened Margaret's chest at the thought of Jenkins and his men systematically scouring the region. Swift Eagle considered the distant smoke with narrow-eyed assessment. "Possibly, or army patrols seeking Lakota winter camps. Neither brings good fortune to our journey." He surveyed their surroundings, clearly calculating options. "We must leave the valley floor, take higher path through forest edge, more difficult travel but less visible to watching eyes." The change in route led them into denser pine forest, climbing the valley's western slope. Progress slowed considerably. As they navigated between close-set trees, the snow deeper and less compacted than along their original path. Margaret struggled to maintain Swift Eagle's pace, aware that their safety depended on reaching more protected terrain before potential pursuit could intercept them. By late afternoon, They had climbed to a position that offered momentary vantage across the valley they had abandoned. Swift Eagle paused, studying the landscape with intense focus. Margaret followed his gaze and felt her blood chill at what became visible in the fading light. Riders, at least 4 or 5, moved along the valley floor, following what must be their earlier tracks. Even at this distance, their purposeful progress indicated hunters following specific prey rather than random patrol. "Jenkins," Margaret whispered, recognizing the distinctive shape of the leader even from afar. Swift Eagle nodded once, his expression grim. "They track with determination. Someone who knows these mountains guides them." The implication sent fear coursing through Margaret. A local guide would know potential routes and shelter locations, perhaps even the location of Swift Eagle's winter camp if they had previously crossed paths. "We cannot outpace mounted pursuit," Swift Eagle said flatly, "must instead outsmart them. Night travel becomes necessary, though dangerous in these temperatures." Margaret squared her shoulders, drawing on reserves of determination. "I'll manage. Whatever pace is required." Swift Eagle studied her with that assessing gaze that missed nothing. "Courage serves well, but physical limits exist regardless of spirit strength. We travel until full darkness, find sheltered place for brief rest, then continue under stars when pursuit makes camp for night." The strategy made sense, though Margaret inwardly quailed at the thought of navigating mountain terrain in darkness. Still, the alternative, capture by Jenkins and his men, provided powerful motivation to overcome her fears. They pushed onward as twilight deepened toward night, climbing steadily along game trails that wound through increasingly rugged country. Margaret focused on placing one foot precisely after another, ignoring the growing pain in her muscles and the cold that penetrated her layers despite exertion's heat. When darkness made further progress too dangerous, Swift Eagle led them to a small hollow beneath a rocky overhang. The natural formation provided minimal shelter but concealed them from casual observation, particularly from the valley below, where Jenkins and his men would likely make camp. "Rest now," Swift Eagle instructed, arranging their sleeping furs. "No fire possible. Share warmth for survival, not comfort." Too exhausted to feel embarrassment, Margaret huddled beside him beneath the layered hides and furs, grateful for human warmth against the deepening cold of mountain night. Despite physical discomfort and the anxiety of pursuit, her exhaustion pulled her toward fitful sleep as Swift Eagle maintained watchful guard. Several hours later, his hand on her shoulder brought immediate wakefulness. The night had grown utterly still, stars brilliant in the black sky overhead. Swift Eagle pointed silently toward the valley below, where a distant pinpoint of light marked their pursuer's campfire. "We move now," he whispered. "They sleep until dawn, believing we cannot travel in darkness." What followed tested Margaret's courage more severely than anything in her previous experience. Guided by starlight and Swift Eagle's uncanny awareness of terrain, they traversed the mountainside in near total darkness, each step potentially disastrous if misplaced. He remained close beside her, occasionally touching her arm to indicate direction changes or hazards invisible until the last moment. "Beartooth Pass lies ahead," he murmured, as false dawn began lightening the eastern sky. Once crossed, pursuit becomes more difficult. Different bands claim territory beyond, complicating travel for men like Jenkins, who respect no boundaries. The pass loomed before them as daylight strengthened, a narrow defile between towering rock formations crusted with ice and wind-scoured. Snow. Swift Eagle studied the terrain with concern. "Avalanche danger exists," he noted. "Recent snow sits on ice layer. Sun's warmth or loud sound could trigger slide." "Is there an alternative route?" Margaret asked, eyeing the precipitous passage with trepidation. "Not without adding 2 days to journey," Swift Eagle replied. By then, Jenkins would circle ahead, block southern approach to winter camp. The decision made itself through lack of viable alternatives. They would attempt the pass, moving as quietly and efficiently as possible to minimize avalanche risk. Margaret followed Swift Eagle's instructions precisely, maintaining silence, testing each step before committing weight, avoiding any action that might disturb the delicate balance of snow on the steep slopes rising around them. Halfway through the narrow passage, Swift Eagle suddenly froze, raising his hand in warning. Margaret stopped instantly, hardly daring to breathe as she watched him listen with complete concentration. After a long moment, he turned to her, expression grave. Riders approach from behind, moving quickly now that they've found our night trail. The danger of their position struck Margaret with terrible clarity. Caught in the narrow confines of the pass, with unstable snow slopes on either side and mounted pursuit closing from behind, they faced a deadly combination of natural and human threats with nowhere to seek cover. The rapid approach of Jenkins and his men behind them, with unstable snow looming above, created an impossible dilemma. Swift Eagle surveyed their precarious position in Beartooth Pass with the swift assessment of a man accustomed to life or death. Decisions. His eyes moved from the narrow confines of the trail to the looming snow-laden slopes, then to Margaret's exhausted but determined face. "We cannot outrun mounted pursuit," he stated quietly. "But perhaps we need not run." Margaret looked at him questioningly, trusting his judgment even as fear threatened to overwhelm her reason. Without explanation, Swift Eagle moved to the steepest section of the pass, where accumulated snow hung precariously from the ridge above. He studied it briefly, then turned back to her. "Avalanche will block pass behind us if triggered properly," he explained. "Sufficient gap exists for us to reach safety before snow fills lower section." The daring plan struck Margaret as simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. "But how can we trigger it precisely enough to protect ourselves while stopping them?" Swift Eagle drew his hunting knife. "Sound travels through mountain. Sharp impact on exposed rock face creates vibration." He pointed to a stone outcropping just visible beneath the snow burden. "When I give signal, run forward without stopping, regardless of what you hear behind." Margaret nodded her understanding, watching as Swift Eagle positioned himself below the rock formation. She moved ahead as directed, poised to sprint forward. At his command, despite her exhaustion, a faint jingle of tack and the muffled thud of hooves on snow reached them. Jenkins and his men entering the lower end of the pass, perhaps a quarter-mile behind. Swift Eagle caught Margaret's eye and gave a sharp nod. She turned and began moving forward as swiftly as her snowshoes and tired legs allowed. Behind her came a series of sharp metallic strikes as Swift Eagle hammered his knife pommel against the rock face. The sound echoed strangely in the confined space of the pass, reverberating between the steep walls. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then a deep, ominous rumble began high above, rapidly growing in volume. Margaret didn't look back, focusing entirely on reaching the wider section of the pass ahead, where the danger of being caught in the avalanche diminished. She heard Swift Eagle's rapid footfalls behind her, matching her pace, then overtaking her, his hand grasping her arm to pull her along faster than she could manage alone. The rumble transformed into a roar as thousands of tons of snow broke free from the mountainside. Shouts of alarm rose from the men behind them, quickly drowned by nature's fury. Swift Eagle and Margaret reached the pass's far side just as the air filled with snow particles and the ground trembled beneath their feet. He pulled her into the shelter of a rock outcropping as the massive slide completed its destructive path across the trail behind them. When the thunder subsided and the air began to clear, they cautiously emerged from their shelter. Where the narrow passage had been, now stood a massive wall of jumbled snow and debris, at least 30 feet high, completely blocking the route through Beartooth Pass. "Jenkins?" Margaret asked, her voice hoarse from exertion and fear. Swift Eagle studied the avalanche's aftermath with practiced assessment. No horses or men visible on this side, either escaped backward before snow reached them or buried beneath. He turned to her, expression grave. We cannot check without risking additional slides. Must continue journey before weather changes. The brutal pragmatism of wilderness survival left no room for uncertainty. Whether Jenkins and his men had survived was immaterial to their immediate needs, reaching the relative safety of the Lakota winter camp before their own strength failed or weather turned against them. They traveled through the remainder of the day without pausing, driven by awareness that the avalanche had bought them time but not permanent security. If Jenkins survived, he would seek alternate routes to intercept them. Swift Eagle set a pace that matched Margaret's capabilities while still covering essential distance, their snowshoes leaving parallel tracks across virgin snow as they descended toward the broad valley where Medicine Lake and the winter encampment awaited. As afternoon waned toward evening, the landscape began to change subtly. The steep mountain terrain gradually yielded to rolling hills and scattered pine groves interspersed with meadows now blanketed in snow. Swift Eagle's bearing shifted, his movements displaying increased vigilance as they entered what Margaret recognized must be territory frequented by his people. We approach hunting grounds, he confirmed when she inquired. Winter camp lies beyond that ridge. He pointed toward a low elevation on the horizon, silhouetted against the fading daylight. We will reach it by nightfall. The prospect of finally ending their desperate flight filled Margaret with conflicting emotions. Relief at the promise of relative safety, anxiety about her reception among the Lakota, and underlying uncertainty about what future might await. Beyond immediate survival, everything familiar had been stripped away in the brief span since Jenkins had abducted her from her cabin. Now she approached an existence Edward would have found fascinating, but which she herself had never imagined. Experiencing, Swift Eagle slowed their pace as they crested the final ridge overlooking the winter encampment. Below, sheltered in a natural bowl formation that blocked the worst winter winds while capturing sunlight, stood a circle of perhaps 30 teepees arranged around a central clearing. Smoke rose from many dwellings, and despite the winter conditions, people moved about performing essential tasks. Women gathering fuel, children playing in the snow, men attending to weapons or tools. We wait here until seen, Swift Eagle explained. Approaching without announcement would cause alarm. They stood visible against the skyline until activity below indicated their presence had been noted. Several men moved toward the perimeter, while women gathered children closer to the camp center. Swift Eagle raised one arm in a gesture Margaret assumed communicated peaceful intent. After a brief consultation, 2 men on horseback departed from the camp, riding toward their position, at a measured pace that suggested caution rather than hostility. As they drew nearer, Swift Eagle murmured, "The elder is Grey Hawk, respected council member. Younger man is Black Fox, who leads hunting parties." Margaret forced herself to stand straight despite exhaustion, knowing first impressions would significantly influence her reception. The riders stopped several yards away, studying them both with unreadable expressions. Grey Hawk spoke in Lakota, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Swift Eagle responded in the same language, occasionally gesturing toward Margaret or in the direction of Beartooth Pass. Though she couldn't understand the words, the rhythm of their exchange suggested explanation rather than argument. After several minutes, Grey Hawk switched to heavily accented English, apparently for Margaret's benefit. "Swift Eagle says you are medicine woman, helped by husband who respected our ways. Now seek shelter after bad men hunted you." "Yes," Margaret confirmed, meeting his evaluating gaze directly. "My husband, Edward Blackwood, learned from Swift Knife. I assisted his healing work until his death. When settlers rejected me, bandits tried to force me to use medicine for their purposes. Greyhawk considered this information, his deep-set eyes, missing nothing of her appearance or demeanor. Swift Knife winters with us. He will determine if your presence brings harm or help to our people. The statement carried neither welcome nor rejection, merely pragmatic deferral to higher authority. Margaret nodded her acceptance of these terms, understanding she could ask for nothing more until Swift Knife had assessed her situation. Black Box, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke in clear, precise English that surprised Margaret. Camp has eyes watching always. Army patrols sometimes come without warning. Your presence will be noted if blue coats appear. The implicit warning was clear. Her presence created potential complications for the entire band. If army representatives discovered a white woman living among the Lakota, they might draw dangerous conclusions regardless of the actual circumstances. Swift Eagle responded with quiet dignity. She walks her own path with courage, deserves consideration before judgment. A subtle communication passed between the men, some understanding beyond words that Margaret couldn't fully interpret. Finally, Greyhawk nodded. Come. Council will hear your story when Swift Knife returns from medicine gathering. Until then, Singing Bird will provide shelter. The pronouncement apparently concluded formal negotiations. They followed the mounted men down the slope toward the encampment where curious eyes tracked their approach. Children were quickly drawn into teepees by watchful mothers, while warriors stood with casual readiness that didn't quite conceal their alertness to potential threat. Near the eastern side of the circle, a middle-aged woman emerged from a well-maintained teepee decorated with painted symbols Margaret recognized as healing signs, similar to those Edward had documented in his journals. The woman, Singing Bird, Margaret presumed, studied her with frank curiosity, but without obvious hostility. Greyhawk spoke briefly to the woman, who nodded before addressing Margaret directly. You stay here until council decides. I speak some English from mission school long ago. You understand? Yes, thank you for your hospitality, Margaret replied, grateful that communication would be possible during her initial transition into this utterly foreign environment. Swift Eagle conferred briefly with Greyhawk, then turned to Margaret. I must report to council elders about what happened at Beartooth Pass. Singing Bird will help you with immediate needs. He hesitated, something uncharacteristically uncertain in his manner. Your path now enters different territory. Mine continues. Elsewhere until certain matters are concluded. The formal phrasing couldn't disguise what Margaret recognized as farewell. Swift Eagle had fulfilled his promise to bring her safely to his people's winter camp, but his responsibilities now drew him elsewhere, perhaps to confirm Jenkins' fate, or to check whether the avalanche had truly ended pursuit. I don't know how to thank you adequately, Margaret said with genuine emotion. You saved my life multiple times over. Swift Eagle shook his head slightly. No debt exists between those who walk with respect. Your husband understood this truth. He glanced toward where Greyhawk waited. Swift Knife returns tomorrow. His voice carries weight in council. Listen more than speak until you understand currents beneath visible surface. With that final advice, he departed with the other men, leaving Margaret in Singing Bird's care. The Lakota woman gestured toward her teepee entrance. Come, you look tired from long journey. Food and rest first, then words. The dwelling's interior proved surprisingly spacious and meticulously organized, with clearly defined areas for cooking, sleeping, and what appeared to be medicine preparation. Margaret noted similarities to Swift Eagle's winter camp accommodations, though this space contained more evidence of permanent habitation rather than temporary shelter. Singing Bird directed her to a seating area, covered with beautifully tanned hides, then busied herself preparing a simple meal without further conversation. Margaret observed her hostess with quiet attention, noting the efficient movements and the obvious care with which she maintained her household. After serving a nourishing stew of dried meat and wild roots, Singing Bird finally settled opposite Margaret. "You are doctor's wife? No plants that heal?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "I worked alongside my husband for many years, learning both his medical training and knowledge shared by Swift Knife." Interest flickered in Singing Bird's dark eyes. "Swift Knife is my father's cousin. He speaks of White Doctor who listened instead of talking. This was your husband." "Edward Blackwood," Margaret nodded. "He believed healing wisdom existed in many traditions, not just those taught in medical schools." Singing Bird considered this information carefully. "Why White Town reject you after husband's journey to spirit world? Women often continue healing. Work when men die." The direct question cut to the heart of Margaret's situation. They didn't approve of our incorporation of Lakota medicine practices. While Edward lived, his position as doctor protected us from criticism. After his death, they claimed my continued use of these methods was— She hesitated, searching for appropriate phrasing. "Contrary to proper Christian practice." Understanding showed in Singing Bird's expression. "Ah, they fear what they do not understand, call it evil instead of different." She stirred the fire thoughtfully. "Same happens when our people try new ways. Old ones say tradition broken, young ones say survival requires change. Truth lives somewhere between." The philosophical observation surprised Margaret, challenging her unconscious assumption that such abstract thinking belonged primarily to educated whites. Singing Bird had articulated in simple language the fundamental tension that existed in all cultures facing rapid change. As evening deepened into night, Singing Bird explained practical aspects of camp life, where water could be obtained, communal activities Margaret might be expected to join, and most importantly, protocols regarding interaction with tribal elders and council members. "Council meets tomorrow when Swift Knife returns," she concluded. "They decide if you stay or must leave when weather permits. Show respect, but not fear." "Fear suggests guilt or deception." Margaret nodded, grateful for the guidance. "How will they judge whether I should remain?" Singing Bird's expression grew serious. "They consider many things. What knowledge you bring that helps people, what danger follows you that threatens band, whether spirits show good or bad signs about your presence." She rose to bank the fire for the night. "Most important is truth when you speak. Elders see past words to heart beneath." In the quiet darkness that followed, lying on borrowed sleeping furs in a Lakota healer's teepee, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From respected doctor's wife to abandoned widow, from captive to fugitive, she had traversed not just physical distance, but cultural boundaries few white women ever crossed. Tomorrow would bring judgment from Swift Knife and the council, whether she represented potential benefit worth the complications. Her presence created, or liability too dangerous to accommodate, regardless of circumstances. Whatever their decision, Margaret recognized that she had already been irrevocably transformed by her experiences since leaving Haven's Mill. Edward had often quoted Emerson to his wife during difficult moments in their frontier practice. "When it is dark enough, you can see the stars." In the deepest darkness of her life, Margaret had indeed glimpsed unexpected light. Swift Eagle's compassion and wisdom, Singing Bird's pragmatic acceptance, perhaps even a path forward that honored Edward's legacy while creating something uniquely her own. Morning brought increased activity throughout the camp as word spread of Swift Knife's imminent return. Margaret remained within Singing Bird's teepee as advised, observing preparations through the partially open entrance flap. Women arranged a central fire in the communal area, children were dressed in better clothing than everyday wear, and elders gathered in small groups for quiet consultation. Near midday, a small party appeared on the northern ridge. 3 riders and several pack horses, laden with what Margaret assumed were medicinal plants, gathered during Swift Knife's expedition. The camp's atmosphere shifted immediately, preparations accelerating as the elders moved to the council area to await his arrival. Singing Bird returned to the teepee, carrying what Margaret recognized as ceremonial clothing. Swift Knife approaches. Council gathers soon. You must prepare. The garments she offered were finer than Margaret's borrowed travel clothes, a dress of soft tanned deerskin decorated with intricate quillwork and subtle beading, moccasins similarly adorned, and a blanket-like wrap of traded wool dyed deep indigo. Margaret changed quickly, conscious that her appearance before the council would communicate important signals about her respect for Lakota customs. When she emerged, Singing Bird nodded approval. Good. You show honor to council through proper preparation. She hesitated, then added with unexpected gentleness. Whatever they decide, remember you walked difficult path with courage. This earns respect even if circumstances require separation. The council gathering occurred in the largest tipi within the encampment, significantly roomier than Singing Bird's dwelling. When Margaret was finally summoned, she found approximately 15 people seated in a semicircle, primarily older, men but including several women whose bearing suggested equal authority despite their smaller number. At the center sat a man. Margaret immediately identified as Swift Knife from Edward's descriptions, slender but sturdy despite advanced years, with penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate on multiple levels simultaneously. Unlike the others, who regarded her with varying degrees of caution or curiosity, Swift Knife's expression showed recognition despite their never having met. Margaret Blackwood, he greeted her in surprisingly good English. Edward's voice often spoke your name when sharing knowledge. Now you stand before us yourself, carried by winds of misfortune. He gestured for her to sit in the space prepared opposite the council. Tell your story so all may understand how our paths cross. With careful consideration for both accuracy and brevity, Margaret recounted the events that had brought her to their winter camp, Edward's death, Haven's Mill's gradual rejection, Jenkins' abduction and her desperate flight, Swift Eagle's rescue and their subsequent journey. Throughout her narrative, the council members listened without interruption, their expressions revealing nothing of their thoughts. When she concluded, Swift Knife spoke again. Edward Blackwood walked between worlds with respect few white men show. His medicine helped many, including my sister's son when fever nearly claimed him. He studied Margaret intently. Now his widow seeks shelter among those her people typically fear. This creates questions council must consider. An older warrior spoke in Lakota, his tone suggesting concern rather than hostility. Swift Knife responded, briefly before translating for Margaret's benefit. Bearclaw asks whether army patrols will seek white woman if they learn of your presence here. Valid concern after soldiers attacked Swift Eagle's family band 3 winters past. I have no connection to military authorities, Margaret assured them. Haven's Mill believes I departed willingly with the Wilkinsons for Fort Benton. If Jenkins and his men survived the avalanche, they would not report my presence here for fear of revealing their own illegal activities. Swift Knife conveyed this information, leading to further discussion among council members. One of the women, silver-haired but straight-backed with dignity, addressed a question directly to Margaret, in halting English. You know plants? Make medicine like husband? Yes, Margaret confirmed. I worked alongside Edward for 15 years, learning both his medical training and knowledge Swift Knife shared with him. I've delivered babies, treated wounds, prepared remedies for various ailments. The woman nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer, and spoke at greater length in Lakota. Whatever she said seemed to shift the council's mood subtly toward more favorable consideration. After nearly an hour of deliberation, during which Margaret maintained respectful silence as Singing Bird had advised, Swift Knife finally addressed her with what appeared to be the council's decision. Winter continues many weeks yet. Until snow melts from mountain passes, you may remain under my protection, learning our healing ways, as Edward did, sharing your knowledge when appropriate. His expression remained serious. When spring comes, Council will meet again to determine longer path forward. The pronouncement represented neither permanent acceptance nor rejection, merely pragmatic acknowledgement of current realities and deferred judgment until circumstances changed with the seasons. It was, Margaret reflected, perhaps the most she could reasonably have hoped for, given the complexities her presence created. I am grateful for the Council's wisdom and hospitality, she responded with genuine humility. I will work to earn the trust you extend and respect the boundaries you establish. As the council dispersed and Margaret returned to Singing Bird's teepee, she found herself experiencing something unfamiliar after months of grief and uncertainty, a tentative sense of possibility. The future remained uncertain beyond winter's end, but for now she had found shelter among people who valued the knowledge she and Edward had cultivated together. That evening, as women from nearby teepees visited with barely disguised curiosity about the white woman in their midst, Margaret recognized the beginning of another journey, one Edward had started but never completed. The path between worlds that Swift Eagle had described so eloquently now stretched before her, challenging but rich with potential for both healing and understanding. Whether this temporary refuge would become permanent home remained for time and circumstance to determine. For now, it was enough that Margaret Blackwood had survived the wilderness crossing, both literal and metaphorical, that had nearly claimed her life. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would face it with the strength, forged in winter's desperate passage from one world to another. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.